So in April of this year, the Israeli moonlander Bereshit earned the dubious distinction of being the first vessel to crash into the moon since 1971. It was a short-lived distinction. India's Vikram lander also crashed into the moon in September, making 2019 a very bad year for man-made objects crashing into the moon. Thankfully, these were vessels without human crews. In the case of the Bereshit lander, however, it was not a vessel without life. The Bereshit moonlander was carrying in its cargo thousands of tiny living creatures called tardigrades, also known as water bears. And these thousands of tardigrades are quite possibly now scattered all over the surface of the moon. Now, the moon is not a friendly environment, right? If I told you that a few thousand baby ducklings were accidentally scattered over the surface of the moon, that would be a very upsetting story. But here's the amazing thing about this story. It is not impossible that the tardigrades are still very much alive up there in their new home on the moon. So what are tardigrades? Well, tardigrades are tiny organisms, microanimals, around 0.5 millimeter long, so you can just barely see them if the conditions are just right. They're probably related to crustaceans or insects, but they're not either of those things. They're an ancient life form. Scientists say tardigrades have been around for about 600 million years. By comparison, we Homo sapiens have been around about 300,000 years, if you want to be generous. Tardigrades are a diverse and widespread category of life. There are over 1,000 species of tardigrades. They make up their own phylum, Tardigrada. They are found on every continent on Earth, under every possible living condition. Wikipedia says, and I believe them, that there are tardigrades in the rainforest, in the Antarctic, at the top of the highest mountains, and found in deep sea volcanoes. The last species of tardigrade to be discovered, I think in 2012, was found in a parking lot in Japan, clinging to a bit of moss. They like to live on moss, which is why they are sometimes also called moss piglets. And tardigrades do sort of look like piglets or bears if you kind of squint and use your imagination. They have blobby, barrel-shaped bodies composed of 4 segments. Each segment has 2 short, stubby little legs with 4 to 8 claws. They have a ring-shaped mouth as the only opening in their head, armed with these kind of tough little spiky things that they use to suck nutrients out of plants, or occasionally smaller, less fortunate tardigrades. Tardigrades look a little bit like an oblong beanbag with a mouth and 8 clawed little legs, or maybe like a teeny tiny loaf of French bread with a mouth and 8 clawed little legs, but they're actually pretty cute. Now, there is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that the great naturalist J.B.S. Haldane was once asked by a theologian what he could deduce about the mind of the Creator from his studies of nature. And the naturalist Haldane said that God appeared to be inordinately fond of beetles. And this joke came from Haldane's observation that there are more species of beetle than any other life form, 350,000 species of beetles. In fact, beetles make up 22% of all species of living things. So if you randomly picked a species from the entire smorgasbord of life to be your new best friend, there's more than 1 in 5 chance you're going to befriend a beetle. In a similar fashion, we could say that God must be inordinately fond of tardigrades because God seems to be deeply committed to keeping them around come what may. Because the amazing thing about tardigrades is their sheer indestructibility. Tardigrade has a trick where it expels all of the water from its body and it curls up into a small, hard ball, seizing almost all metabolic activity. This is called a ton state. And a tardigrade in this state can survive conditions that would kill almost any other living organism. You can freeze a tardigrade to a temperature barely above absolute 0. You can bake it in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. No problem. It will go on about its business. They can survive pressures 6 times greater than the pressure found in the deepest ocean trenches. You can blast them with cosmic radiation, 100 times the level that would kill a human being. They will be fine. They can survive in a vacuum for 8 days. Tardigrades in a ton state have been documented to survive without food or water for up to 30 years. Then they get revived with a little bit of water and they go on about their merry way. They have survived all 5 of Earth's great extinctions, and the odds are pretty good that they will survive the 6th great extinction, the one that biologists say we are currently living through right now. And now there are tardigrades on the moon as well. Will they survive there? Well, they might if they can keep away from UV radiation. UV radiation, it turns out, is tardigrade kryptonite. But if they landed in a spot on the moon where they're shielded from the UV radiation, then the bear sheet tardigrades might stand a good chance of survival. This is according to Mark Martin, a professor of biology at University Puget Sound. He said, my guess is that if we went up in the next year or so, recovered the wreckage, found these tiny little tons, and put them in water, few of them would come back to life. So when I think about these hardy little moss piglets orbiting overhead, first I have to give them mad respect. What a wondrous piece of work is the tardigrade. And then my imagination goes to some future lunar visitor, some far distant extraterrestrial wanderer who comes to the moon and what they might now find there, right? Various wrecked Earth vehicles, apparently more and more all the time, some astronaut footprints to ponder over, the fossils of bacteria trapped in discarded bags of astronaut poop. Yes, there's astronaut poop on the moon. And now they will find tardigrades as the best evidence of life on Earth. And who is to say which discovery will elicit from them greater wonder? We humans like to think of ourselves as the apex species, as the crowning achievement of life on Earth. Before the theory of evolution, the fundamental theory to explain the appearance of diversity in life on the Earth, at least in the West, was the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, right? The Christian Old Testament. The book of Genesis says that the universe, the earth, all life was created over the course of 6 days by God, and then at the very end of the 6th day, as the final act of creation, to cap off this mad crafting project, God made humans as the only object made in the image of God. And then God put us in charge of everything that had come before. In the story, it says we humans are granted dominion over the earth and all living things. And in that single word, dominion, lies the capacity for some very big, long-term theological, spiritual, and cultural problems. Now, I'm not intending to critique Judaism here or put it in the box, right? The book of Genesis is one of the foundation stories of Judaism. And there are ways of reading this creation myth that understand God to be calling humans to live in deep ecological harmony with all of creation as stewards and protectors. The Jewish concept of tikkun olam calls us to be faithful healers of the world. But an unsophisticated idea of dominion, which understands our relationship to nature to be one of power over, an unsophisticated idea of dominion warps our relationship with living things, replacing mutuality and interdependence with domination and exploitation. And I would suggest that this unsophisticated idea of dominion still informs our Western way of thinking and our Western way of life. Now, the story of special creation and dominion was the story of life in the West, our creation story for most of our history. And then along comes the theory of evolution, and it takes the idea of the special creation of human life, that human life is radically different from all other kinds of life, the only life in the image of God. And it replaces this idea with the idea that all life, including human life, is the process of one continuously unfolding act of creation set in motion by the birth of the universe. 14 billion years ago, give or take. 12 billion years from the Big Bang to make a Milky Way galaxy and to shape it and properly cool it. water it, create this earth, and then after the appearance of life on earth, about 2 billion years, give or take, for the first replicating molecules to organize into living cells, and those living cells to diversify into the life that we all see all around us. One continuous product in which everything is linked to everything else. Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, hypothesized, and science tends to confirm this view, that all things alive today are the common descendants of one ancestral organism. And from this single root grew the tangled tree of life, as species branched off and branched off and branched off from their forebears, each branch finding their own unique way to make a successful living in the ecosystem. Now, popular depictions of evolution often greatly simplify this process and show this kind of linear march of life forms through time, right? A lot of us have seen these posters like on school walls or wherever. You've got like the kind of squaggly amphibian thing that kind of becomes a fish, and the fish crawls out onto the earth with little legs, becomes a reptile, becomes a mammal, and then maybe some primates like marching upwards to become humans. And this arrangement visually suggests a process of replacement, of lower forms being replaced by higher forms. It reads like a story of progress still, with humans at the end of this long chain of evolution. And in this way, we preserve the emotional content of the idea of dominion. We preserve this idea of humanity's specialness within this new framework of evolution. We think naturally in terms of lower and higher life forms, and we place ourselves at the top of this ladder of being. The question is sometimes asked from thinking of life as this progression from sort of worse to better, of things replacing other things, that if monkeys evolved into humans, then why are monkeys still around? And it's not a bad question, but it comes from a misunderstanding of evolution, because monkeys did not evolve into humans. What evolution says is that monkeys and humans share a common ancestor. So at some point in the far distant past, there was a thing that was not a monkey and not a human, and some of its ancestors settled on the monkey way of being in the world, which is awesome. And some of its ancestors settled on the human way of being in the world, which is equally awesome. So evolution is not a linear progression at all. It is a branching process by which organisms find and discover different awesome ways of being in the world. And so our human species is like, if you picture a bush with just millions of branches and little green shoots going off in every direction, we're like one teeny tiny little shoot on this enormous tangled bush, each shoot having come into existence in exactly the same way. And so how arrogant, how absurd to circle our one tiny little shoot and say, yeah, this is clearly the reason that this great plant exists. And all of the whole of this exists to serve this one tiny little shoot, indistinguishable from all the others. And so evolution has been called a second Copernican revolution. The first Copernican revolution said the earth, and thus humankind, is not at the center of the universe. Rather, it lies in one corner of a spiraling galaxy amidst billions of galaxies. Evolution, the second Copernican revolution, said that humanity is not at the center of the biosphere either. We're not a special act of creation made by God on the last act, given dominion over the earth. We are not above other living beings. And in this way, evolution proposes a radical decentering of the human story and the overall story of life on earth. We're one species among millions, all created by the same unthinking process, neither more nor less likely, neither more nor less chosen, neither more nor less destined to a bright future. Evolution tells us, in the words of UU minister, the Reverend Force Church, that we all come from a common source, all living things. We all come from a common source, and we all share a common destiny. And what a common source it is, right? Born of ancient stars whose matters traversed billions of miles of space to shape our galaxy, our world, and ultimately become our very flesh and blood. We have stardust in our bones and stardust in our veins. And our story is as old as the universe and inseparable from the universe. What magic and mystery and dignity there is in this story of creation. Now, you can certainly believe in evolution and still believe in a creator God. Some 30% of Americans who believe in evolution also believe that this process was set in motion or somehow inspired by or guided by a divine being. Now, it's important to understand that scientifically speaking, the theory of evolution does not require a divine being in order to work. By random mutation and chance and a lot of time is sufficient to explain the life that we see. But evolution is not incompatible with a God initiating the process. And what I would say is, if you believe that evolution is the means by which God created life, then I would urge you to consider the story of evolution as a kind of alternative creation text to the Genesis story. And then ask, what is the meaning of this story? If God chose to create life, why did God choose this process over all other processes? A process that emphasizes our kinship, our interconnectedness, our interdependence with all other living things. And then what messages would we read into this scientific text about the intentions of our Creator, if Creator we have? The dominion mythos, the story that we have been placed above nature as its ruler, has been a ticking time bomb within our culture, I believe. So long as humans were limited in our capacity to materially affect our environment, this worldview might condone the local exploitation of animals, the local despoilation of the environment, but it could not break out to do global harm. But for the last several centuries, the astonishing increase in our technological prowess has been harnessed to the engine of global capitalism to exert our dominion over the natural world to an unprecedented degree. And too late, we are discovering as climate change and species extinction spiral out of control, that our pretense at dominion is an illusion, that it always was an illusion, that we remain in the end utterly dependent on natural systems far greater than our ability to predict and control. And so we need a creation story that emphasizes our kinship with the web of life. We need a creation story that restores dignity to the natural world and all of its living inhabitants. We need a creation story that brings us back into oneness with the processes that nurture and sustain us. And we need a creation story that reconnects us to the enchantment and awesomeness of the natural world, to the wonder all around us. In our reading today, Reverend Kathleen Mateague wrote about learning to think in geological time with a frame of reference that decenters the human story and places us in the framework of this larger creation story. And she says, we might learn not only to think like a stone, but also to think like an American chestnut or an elm, to think like a peeper or a cicada, a hawk or a red fox, a vulture, a coral reef, or an Amazon butterfly. She says we might come to believe that their lives on earth matter as much as our own. To Charles Darwin, we owe the discovery that written into each creature, howsoever humble, is the history of the universe. You, me, the squirrels chasing each other on the lawn, the beetles churning the soil underneath us, the birds serenading above, the tiny tardigrades clinging to the moss, or even now the surface of the moon. We are all part of the same ancient story of life unfolding since before even the stars lit skies. And within us and through us all moves the same creative force, bringing endless new life into being. And so we are in deep kinship with life teeming around us. So let this be the beginning of a new creation story. Not a story of separation, dominion, domination, and exploitation, but a story of connection and care. Let us recognize before it is too late our deep interdependence with the web of existence. Let us act before it is too late to protect and preserve this earth, our home. And let us learn before it is too late to live from a place of gratitude, reverence, and familial affection for all living things. If we can tell a new story, we can imagine a new way. May this new story we tell then be a story of renewal, a story of hope, and a story of healing for a world that so needs healing. Blessed be, and amen.